So let me welcome everyone. Let me welcome you to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your host, chat herder for the day. I'm very, very glad to see all of you here today on May 26th. Where I live in Vermont, we suddenly have spring. So I am giddy with the possibility of growth and change. Welcome, everybody. If you're new to the Shindig environment, let me just quickly acclimate you. This is where we're going to be spending the next hour. And what you're looking at is a video conferencing platform. Let me just show you a couple of key details about it. Where you see me and this little slide off to my right, this is called the stage. This is where presenters' discussions are. The bottom half of the screen, you can see a whole swarm of individual icons. Some of them are portraits, some of them are video feeds. That's where participants are. And as you'll see during the next hour, you'll see people come, go, move around the bottom half. Now, there are 4 different ways that you have to interact with us as the presenters and interact with each other. To begin with, look at the bottom right part of your screen. You'll see that there are 2 orange buttons. One of them has a little hand and the word raise. If you click that button, this will tell us that you would like to speak. And once the time is right, we'll knock somebody off the stage, probably me, and bring you up. So as long as your mic and your camera are working, we get to come on and have a conversation. The second option is that little orange button that says Ask. If you click on that, that is a kind of super chat. Type in your question or comment, and I get to read that. And when the time is right, I'll read that out loud for George and I to discuss. A third way to interact is by chat. So if you take your cursor and mouse it over your profile, you'll see 4 little boxes appear. One of them says, I am chat. If you click that, you'll be able to text chat with everybody else in the room. As people enter Shindig, they get put into different rooms, maximum size, I think about 20 right now. So you should be able to see everybody in your room. You can private chat to individuals or group chat to the whole thing. And as a 4th way, if you're on Twitter, please tweet at us. Please tweet questions or comments. Use the hashtag FTTE or just gchat directly at me or at George. And we'll have a couple of links in as we go. I'm glad to see all of you here. Let's take a look at some slides to introduce the day. So next slide, please. Let you know that the Future Trends Forum is a spin-off of my Future Trends in Technology and Education project. This is a monthly environmental that takes a look at major trends that impact transformation of education and technology. If you haven't seen the reports or if you're curious about it, please go to ftte.us. You can look at some back reports and contact me for more questions. Next slide. I want to thank 2 agencies for supporting us who have been just very, very heroic in their efforts. To begin with, NiserNet has been a supporter throughout 2016 of FTTE, and we're very grateful for their help. The other that's especially visible here is Shindig. They do 2 wonderful, wonderful things for us. As you can see here, they make the technology possible. And what you might not see is that they have a whole bunch of wonderful staff who do all kinds of work in producing, doing outreach for this, and making all the bells and whistles work together smoothly. So we're very, very grateful to Shindig for their help. Now, today, our guest in the Future Trends Forum is George Siemens. George is, as we just found out before the session began, an extensive traveler who is actually going to talk to us from an airport, very appropriately. He is currently based in 2 countries and 2 institutions, the University of Texas Arlington and Athabasca University. If you don't know George, first of all, you should. He is one of the most important thinkers and practitioners in the world of education and technology. He's well known as a very influential edu-blogger. He's one of the creators of the very important theory of connectivism. He's one of the founders of MOOCs and one of the most important brains in that business. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to George and interact with him, those are the links to his blog and his Twitter feed. Again, I strongly recommend paying attention to him. Now, speaking of which, why don't we knock these slides off the stage and bring George on up.
Welcome.
Greetings, George.
Hey, Brian. Good to be here.
Looks like you found a good nook.
You're going to get a little bit of background noise periodically, so I'll try and mute that a little bit, but it's the joy of the airport.
I understand. I understand completely. Yesterday, I flew in through Philadelphia, and as our plane tried to pull away from the dock, we couldn't because the jet bridge stuck onto the plane, and they had to spend about an hour and a half just trying to get the thing off. And it's a terrible metaphor for American infrastructure, I think. We have so many things to talk about, so many different topics, but I wanted to leap right in with one in particular that you recently posted about. And it's one that we've been discussing on the Future Trends Forum for several months now. It's a question of what's happening with data and what's happening with data analytics for learning. In your recent post, you raised a whole series of important questions. And one of the things that I appreciate about this is that you saw this as a very complex, multi-stranded problem. Where do you see data analytics heading in the near future for education?
I think in the near future it'll sort of be a shit show, and by that I basically mean it's going to be companies trying to make money off of it. It's going to be academics that are seeing this emerging. There's going to be the natural ego of wanting to stake claim and build research labs and so on. And so I think in the near future, there's not really a whole lot useful coming out of it, to be honest. I think the long-term potential is quite significant because it'll have an influence on really everything that we do in university settings, because it's the kind of thing that touches on resource allocation, it touches on teaching practices, it touches on really everything that we do, and ultimately it'll touch on how students learn, feedback that we provide to students, and so on. So I'm optimistic about its long-term potential, but I'm very unsure that potential will be a good thing.
Well, let's break this up in time. And start off with the short term. Data analytics has been an issue in the business world and the government world for decades now, really. The movie and the book Moneyball have been around for quite some time. Surely we should be better than short-term chaos in academia. What's making this so difficult for us to implement in a useful way?
I think the biggest thing is that it's worth noting that education is always contested space. It doesn't matter what you're doing, it's one of the primary knowledge systems of society, and when it's a primary knowledge system, everybody who has a vested interest cares. That means that you've got your political extremes that care, you've got people who have a more social perspective that care, you have businesses that care, you have governments that care. The list goes on. It literally is a never-ending cycle of issues that arise. So sorry for the background noise here. This is the last time I'll acknowledge. I'll just pretend I don't hear it. It's just in your head as viewers. So I think that's one element. It's contested space, and that's just natural. Secondly, it's a massive investment that the government makes. And the investment that it makes produces uncertain outcomes. So like if I go into a hospital to get a heart transplant and I come out with like an extra limb sticking out of my chest, I would probably view that as being a failure. But metaphorically, we do that all the time educationally. We send a student to school and this is what we want, and all of a sudden we get completely different outcomes. And the reason is that unlike a lot of situations, especially business, where you have a variable you're trying to optimize, when you're involved with learners, the very node that you're trying to, so to speak, optimize has its own agency, its own autonomy. And that means it can't be manipulated and shaped without consequences. And so that's probably one of the bigger components that I see, is that the most systems treat the problem as a single variable problem, which means we need more money, now we have a solution, or we need more quality teachers, now we have a solution. But none of those will work. You will never see dramatic educational change when you're proposing single variable solutions. And the reason is education's a complex system. You pull one end of the network, you're going to impact another end of the network. And so even when I watched, Waiting for Superman as an example, it said it was primarily about teachers. But even then, you say, okay, now you optimize for teachers, or now there's other factors that come out of it. So you until we start seeing learning as an integrative, complex ecology, we are never going to make sustained change through anything. So add data analytics to this mess, you're going to keep having the same problem. You just might be able to push a particular agenda that you have more confidence in numerically, but you're not necessarily going to have a better system. So I think short term, the issue is that there's a lot of vendors popping up. There's a lot of stakeholders who want quantitative or empirical sort of data about how we're doing as a system, and yet everything that we know about effective learning isn't reflected through better analytics. It's reflected through quality of teaching, care, compassion, human consideration.
I was really, I have a whole series of questions to ask and reflections to bounce back at you. And I think your last statement, everything we know about learning isn't reflected in analytics, is a very, very powerful one. And that echoes some of the thoughts we've had from previous guests, such as Audrey Waters and Gardner Campbell. But I wonder, how are you seeing this play out on the global stage? That is, are there particular nations or regions where learning analytics are playing out in a different way?
Australia is a positive one so far, but then I'm not confident that the current government's initiatives in the higher education sector will have the impact that they want. So instead, we're going to keep seeing some pressure that's going to come out from an attempt to make the education system more vibrant is going to really just make it more numerical. I'm going to find a better place here. These speakers are amazingly effective. Come for a walk, people. So as a result of, I think those...
All the way along.
Yeah, we're just going outside here. So that's the issue I think that we see in Australia as well, and really any country, is that the interest is, as a contested space, there's a lot of people who have different input on what this ends up becoming. And right now, and I've had a few conversations with different people in sort of edu-blog space and Twitter lately. Some of it's been a little more contentious than necessarily desirable, but the reality is that we're seeing change happening, and there's some very powerful forces that have an interest in structuring change in such a way that it has some potential economic value. And that's quite often the startup community, and I have nothing against the startup community, so I don't mean to be critical about that, but it is one narrative. And if you have individuals who have unfettered ability to enact change, or at least to drive an agenda, and you don't have people aware of what's happening, you get exactly the situation that we have nationally, internationally around with data access. Our data is being used as a commodity, as a transactive entity, and so we're being monitored and surveyed at a level that we're not comfortable with. But the best time to have paid attention was 15 years ago when this was starting to happen. And I think the same issues arise with education. Is the best time to pay attention to the factors at play really should have been a while ago, but now that we're starting to see some of these players, we're seeing this reconfiguration of a network of influence. And so, I spent a lot of time in learning analytics. I was involved in setting up the Society for Learning Analytics Research as its founding president. It's been going on now for, I guess, it's entering its 7th year, so I'm well aware of what's possible with analytics, and I'm excited about the prospect. But I think the system will reject it as from the lens that I hope it would be manifest, namely effective learning and so on. And I also think that those outside of the system, from a particular startup community, will see it as a wedge to cause this rumored disruption in education. I'm going to try to be happy with this.
Well, I hate to say it, but every Future Trends forum, we've had this oscillation between utopia and dystopia. So we have to be very, I try and monitor this. I'm becoming one part therapist. You mentioned this is a startup ethos, but which I understand and I accept. That makes a lot of sense. I've had some very interesting conversations with some startup schools, and that you've identified it precisely. But how come we're also seeing interest in this from larger companies, established such as textbook companies and LMSs, as well as governments? Do you think this data-driven ethos is simply that much more widespread?
Yeah, that's a trick question, and I think the important thing to note there is that textbook companies lost the battle for openness to the OER movement, but they've won the war because they gave up on the object being the content, and instead have turned their attention to the intelligence around that content. And so that's where the OER movement has been very neglectful, is that they haven't built analytics in, and some people outright dismiss analytics, but you can hate something and still recognize that it's an important factor to think about. So you can think analytics are crap, and at some level I do, but you can't deny that they're influential. You can be completely against taxes and hate them all you want, but the reality is you're paying taxes and it's shaping a society and it's funding military activities. So that's how I sort of look from an analytics perspective, and I think those companies, like Pearson's and others in particular, recognize early on you can't win free, but you can win against value layers. And so the OER movement hasn't paid much attention to adaptive learning and some of these activities, which government funding and research agencies and foundations have paid attention to. And so in a sense, we are fighting a ghost of an opponent because they're not putting their resources into the openness space to fight against the OER movement. Their resources are being directed into a completely different battlefield, which I keep arguing we need to be at the table, and there's others that argue I don't want to be at the table is crap, which is also an equally fair point. I'm just going to keep walking because I realize I left my laptop bag and they're probably destroying it somewhere right now.
Well, you are, a foreigner interloper, and you just said bad things about data analytics. I mean, you are clearly a hostile terrorist. So we'll keep this going as long as we can. Just had George pop out. While he's fighting back in, let me just mention a couple of comments that have come up in Twitter, which I think are very, very important. One that Evans mentioned is that it's really important that we should have been thinking clearly and being very vested in open data for education a while ago, that in many ways we're a little bit late right now. George, are you back?
I feel like I'm back. Can you hear me? I don't see your smiling face, though.
Well, I can smile if you want. I hear you and I can see you. I hope you are re-embagged.
I have my laptop. They had not yet destroyed it.
Oh, very good. Well, you cunning Canadians, you are just known for being able to circumvent authority. When we left off, you had the wonderful phrase that textbook companies are learning that you cannot win against free, but you can win in value layers. I think it was a really striking observation, and people have retweeted that like mad. Well, still in the short term, you have identified a series of real major challenges and also some major problems. What advice do you have for people in the education and technology sphere in the short term? What do you recommend that folks do?
I think so. This is my, and there's a number of factors at play, and Michael Caulfield had a good blog post on this recently about some of these coalitions that we had early on when we started in the ed tech space and the people that were involved in change. And I think you're starting to see some of these things come to a head with different values and different views of change. So, for example, my view of change is one that is based largely on Carlotta Perez's assertion that fundamental change happens in socio-technical economic systems. And so as a result of those changes,
yes.
We have to evaluate what's happening. Like, change is not, it doesn't happen too much. There's active agents that make change happen. And so if we recognize that change is ongoing in society and technologically, then if we want a future that embodies the values that are important to us, then we have to be active participants in the socio-technical and economic spaces that are driving that change. And so that's my assertion. I've had chats with good colleagues like Stephen Downs, and he's basically, no, I don't want that system, I'm going to work outside of that system. And I respect that. There's different ways of enacting change in different systems.
Okay, so George is going to have to recover his connection. Again, I admire his efforts to stay connected in an airport. But that last point is really critical. If you haven't read it, Carlotta Perez's book is a very, very important, or her research in general, is a way of taking a look at technological changes. And she makes a very, very convincing case for the intertwined levels of not just culture, society, and technology, but also the involvement of finance in making any technology happen. Very accessible, very important stuff. Now, let's see what we have on Twitter. People have been tweeting like mad, celebrating a lot of comments. Michael Berman just highlighted one key point here, that there's a decision to make about facing this kind of change. Do you want to play a role in engaging the complex forces of transformation, or do you want to work outside the system? So he is obviously arguing for the former, but also citing that other people, most notably Stephen Downs, are agitating for the latter, the ability to work outside of the system. This is an ancient dilemma, but it's important to see. Welcome back, George.
Yeah, and I don't know what this is. It keeps booting me off. I have a good connection, but anyway, it may just be my attire and my cantankerous disposition. But yeah, that just your was accurate. I respect that there are many different ways of driving change. My particular articulation for the view of change that I have is based on just the general view that the decisions that are impacting all of us in a dramatic way are happening in the way that algorithms get developed. They're happening in the ways that technologies get bought by school districts and universities. They're happening in a range of different ways. And I think all attempts to drive change are helpful and valuable. For example, if you're interested with global warming, somebody's going to fight for the preservation of the rainforest. Somebody is going to try to get it on the political agenda of states and provinces, and someone else is going to make sure that that bottle of water that they had gets properly recycled. All acts of change are equally consequential and important, but some have a different type of an impact. And one thing that's been interesting is just seeing how some of the different views toward change produce actually a bit of an internalizing of conflict within our community, rather than sort of targeting what we all think is a certain view of a positive education system.
So the question is, looking at the long-term impact of data analytics in higher education, do you see any particular different ways this could unfold? Is there a utopian versus a dystopian way? Do you see different schools of thought, perhaps different ways of running a university in terms of data analytics?
Yeah, look, first of all, I'll just say I'm genuinely sorry that I'm taking people's time and have such a poor connection here. It's not very professional of me, and I'm sorry about that. I do think there are different futures that can emerge. I think, as with anything else, a technology is not. It's not something completely by itself. I mean, there are inherent attributes within a technology. There are things that we can do with one technology over another technology. Idea of the action potential, the affordances, as Gibson would put it. But in fairness, there are some things that tools are better for. So while analytics are not necessarily evil in themselves, but they certainly can be used to favor one view of what learning is over another view. And one view, for example, might be our ability to quantify and measure and sort students could be done better with technology or with analytics. But on the other hand, analytics could also be utilized to improve the quality of the ability to identify students who are at need and our ability to reasonably quickly provide them with support and intervene. It might also be able to look at metrics that go beyond just assessing what a student's learning in a course. For example, we could look at assessing some of the affect developments. We could auto-generate, could make recommender systems on next point learning content and so on. But part of the challenge that I see is that we're trying to bring analytics into an education system that I'm not convinced is structured the way that we really need to have it structured. And what I essentially mean with that is that our education system today, if we bring analytics into it, we'll use it to highlight those parts of the systems that can be controlled. I would like to think that if we were to do analytics well, we would have a system where we build a good profile of the learner that the learner owns. We develop this idea of an open learning analytics platform where researchers see the algorithms and people can see the bias within those algorithms. And we start moving to the idea of computed curriculum, where a course doesn't exist in advance. It's only created as a learner starts with a learning experience. And once we connect their profile with the subject matter that they're dealing with, that curriculum is literally computed to provide them with the best resources to support their existing learning and to increase their how quickly they achieve a degree or recognition. So we're confined by so many structures that are time-based. We're confined by the credit hour. We're confined by how many years it takes to get a bachelor's. We're confined by the mindsets of what learning is in a perspective. I don't see why someone coming from industry couldn't come back and get a master's in 3 weeks if they have the capability to get a master's. And so that's the part where I think we'll see the greatest potential is if we start asking questions about which attributes of our current education system are no longer aligned well with what we're capable of doing with analytics and technology.
You should know that George, that on Twitter there's now a conspiracy theory about you, where people are convinced that every time you say certain words, your connection drops. I just thought you should know that you are already part of another story. Let's step aside for a second and let's throw these questions out to the entire audience. If you're new to the Future Trends Forum, here's what we do. At this point in the hour, myself and the interlocutor of the hour step off the stage and we mingle with you guys. We do this as we all together try to wrestle with a question. And the question I'd like to pose to you is, what can we all do in the short-term future about data analytics in education? So by short-term, I mean from now to, say, the next 2 years the most. And think of what you can do where you are, at your institution, in your region, based on your profession. If you're a librarian, a technologist, a faculty member, administrator, or whatever. And if you would like to be available to speak with different people, please join up. You'll see that the minute I launch this, all these, on the bottom half of the screen, you'll see all these icons start swarming back and forth. If you don't want to talk to somebody right now because either your mic and camera don't work, or if you're just feeling very, very shy, mouse over yourself and you'll see a little lock option that can lock you out. Please do that if you don't feel like talking. But for right now, let's talk as much as we can about what we should do about data analytics in the short-term future. These are the Shindig folks. If you kick me off the stage, I can pounce on some people to talk. Well, we're back. Greetings, friends. I'm glad to be back up here on stage. George, now, did you have a chance to talk to anybody in the audience?
Sorry, I didn't have a chance to speak with anyone, so I'd say feel free to call anyone up on stage while I'm, because I rebooted in the middle to see if that was the issue.
Okay. Now, let me bring up people and we'll see if we can get them to talk to you. If the connection at the airport is problematic, then we'll push you off and I'll try and ventriloquize. So to begin with, friends, if you have an observation or a question that came out of your discussion, please either click the raise hand button so we can bring you up on stage, or click the ask button. Again, if you have a video connection and an audio connection and you feel like talking, please click the raise hand. If you lack those, or if you're shy, that's perfectly fine. Click the ask button and I'll read it back. If you're in the chat room with me right now, please use the chat box. Well, if you're in any chat room, please use the chat box. But if you're in my room, type in something and I can use that as well. Just to get things rolling, I had a great conversation with a wonderful person in Louisiana who said, she chimed in with your short-term view, George, pretty closely. She said that there was interest locally, but that it wasn't something that could be handled very quickly. She saw interest in marketing and communication, but expense was seen as a major obstacle.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in on that, I think that's a big part of it is its expense, but not just from an economic end. There's also a capability and a capacity thing at stake, and I think you might recall this when in the late 90s or even mid 2000s we wanted to start doing more with online learning, but there was really a capability issue. The infrastructure for technology wasn't there, whether it's LMS or even just more of a awareness of social media. The capabilities of leadership to plan for that wasn't there either, which meant that essentially the vendors drove the decision-making process. And I think we're seeing the same happen. Is it's, as an admin, if you're not comfortable with what role data and analysis can play in decision-making, or even in teaching and learning, then ultimately you have a power imbalance where the vendor makes the calls, basically.
That makes a lot of sense. And it seems like right now vendors potentially in the catbird seat. I wonder if there's any option for an academic product to compete with them.
Well, and I think if you look at how some of the vendors are currently playing the landscape, you're going to have the most incredible lock-in that we've ever had. And I've said before, I think this is the last generation that most universities and systems are going to start looking at a new learning management system. And the reason is that if you, once you integrate your learning systems with your business practice systems, you don't change anymore. So, when's the last time someone has changed their accounting systems? You do this once every 20 years because it's hell. And so once you're learning it, and so once your learning analytics system, whatever it is that you're buying today gets, and they are, the vendors that are being the most successful are integrating them with systemic and organizational software, you're never changing again. And it's no longer about now can your whatever initiative, your social media or your, let individuals take different pathways to the learning practice. Once you're driven by analytics, you're going to be driven by one fundamental factor, and that is, can we control the data? And if we can't get at the data, such as it might happen if you have people working on social media or using Twitter or Known or even Slack or other tool sets that give a little more control to the individual, even if they're not open. But once those tool sets don't afford the organization the data that they want in order to make their models function, everything is locked down. And so I think pedagogically, analytics could become a tremendous disabler of pedagogical innovation as much as they could be an enabler of more effective practices.
Well, I asked you before about long-term possibilities, and it sounds like that's one, those are two different long-term outcomes that we can anticipate. One where we get locked into a learning analytics vendor or set of vendors that really does have positive or progressive affordances, and the other is that we're stuck with a bad one for our generation. We have a question from Susan Adams. So let me get off the stage and let Susan come up, please. It's about an ethics guide. Go ahead.
Hi, George. I don't know if you can hear me. Our small group was talking about the possibility of there being an ethics guide to analytics. Now, I appreciate your comment just now in saying that analytics, if you're tied too much to it, it drives the pedagogy perhaps in ways that aren't positive. But I really appreciate the need for us to look together as a community and even build a culture of ethics around how we use analytics. Are there guides out there that are emerging within our field that we can begin to look to and or put a call out for that to start to emerge?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And I would say yes, the best guide I've seen is what the Open University UK has done around learning analytics. So they basically have a guide around how analytics will be used in the learning process. So it's been from the lens of learning rather than from the data availability. And I think that's a very promising kind of initiative. And even though I'm trying to articulate why analytics can be problematic, there's a lot that can be good about it, but we have those voices that are telling us what's good about them already. So I'm less worried. So keep in mind that just because I'm saying one thing doesn't mean that I disagree with the opposite of it, or it doesn't mean that I disagree with the things that I'm not saying. I think there is value for analytics, and I think particular researchers are going to find tremendous value with learning analytics going forward. We're already starting to see some really interesting work that's coming out. We're doing a conference at Stanford in November around wearables and learning, which generate physiological data that can also be used as part of evaluating how a learner is doing and performing and so on. So there's a lot of potential benefits with it. I think starting with an ethics end is important, and I also think it's important that we recognize that we should be involved if openness around algorithms and learning analytics practices is important to us. We should be starting to make that a conversation when we're talking to vendors. But I know some LMS vendors where you actually buy back your data, meaning your students generate it, and then when you want to analyze it, you have to buy it back. You pay extra for that data access, basically. They won't call it buying back, but it's just the ability to analyze your own data. So I think these are the kinds of questions we should really be saying, is it open? Because if it's open, we can correct inefficiencies that might be, some of you might have seen recently, there was a post around crime models that are structured so that they're biased toward African Americans. And that's obviously a huge challenge. But if an algorithm is closed, we don't know that. We don't know the dials are being spun behind the scenes. As one example is Newton. I've talked about Newton in the past. They're an adaptive learning company, and they make some really bold claims. And very smart folks like Michael Feldstein and others, Phil Hill, that are well acquainted with this space, go on record as basically saying it's snake oil. But you can't have, like, if you look at their reports, there's no revered academic at a university that analyzed it. It's some dude in marketing that decided this is what we should say. So that's where the issue comes in for me. The biggest thing is if we have openness around our pedagogical practices and the analytics that we're using to sort and influence our students, we at least can change them. But we don't even have that low basic level of openness around the data. And even worse, we're not going to have openness around the software systems, because most academics that don't like learning analytics just step away from the conversation. They don't try and shape it. That's why I've been very pleased with people like Audrey Waters and others that at least raise the concern and raise the flag. So your question, best example I've seen is what Open University has done with their manual.
Yeah, one more question. If we were able to give students ownership of their data, what would you suggest as a way to teach them? Because I think about the students being the drivers of this, and if they were given their own data, just thinking about how we teach them how to use that and use it as a way to shape their own education. If and when we got there, if we could ignite an inspiration in the students of what they can do with it, that could be a driver for changing the institution. Maybe that's a utopic idea or far-reaching, but curious.
Yeah, no, I think there's one of the big benefits of data availability to students is obviously their ability to self-regulate, and that's what we really want in education. Is we want to foster the development of individuals who are able to meet their own needs around knowledge in other areas and to be self-regulated. So I think it's a terrific goal or vision. One problem, though, is that if you look at how many individuals in education are comfortable with statistics or advanced statistics, never mind starting to look at machine learning models or starting to look at neural networks and so on, I think you'll find that there's actually not the level of skill that we need to do this. So there's this movement that says everybody should code, and there's some that have pushed back at that. But I would start to say everybody should have a functional level of data literacy, simply to understand the data process, to understand where does the data come from, what shape is it in, how does it get stored, what kinds of tool sets are being used to analyze it, and when it's being analyzed, what does it mean? Like, what's a decision tree? What's a regression model? I mean, I think the underpinning ideas of predictive models and of recommender systems, they're not difficult to understand. And I don't even mean technically. I'm not saying someone needs to go out and build their own recommender model. I mean, can you understand the logic of a recommender model? Can you understand what it does and how it does it? So I think all algorithms should be written in plain English as well. You're taking data from here to do this, because that's the challenge. So we ourselves need to become more literate in understanding the logic of analysis, not necessarily the mechanical or technical details, but at minimum we should be able to see when we've been sorted, how did we get sorted? What was the bias that was in it? What was the data sources that influenced it? How are those various elements in a data source weighted? So recently with a group of doctoral students, I did a project with a major vendor, hardware and software, and they had a particular algorithm that they were using to do some sorting with students. And when we started looking at the algorithm they had developed, it was like all these factors, everything was identically weighted. There was no adjusting for, let's say, the prevalence of spending time on task. There was no release time if you just had a button open and the page was sitting there and you might have gone to do something else. There was no point of timing out. And so it was a model that was very easy to game. It was very poorly designed, and yet potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of K-12 students were being sorted by this very rudimentary algorithm. And even if somebody would have spelled it out in plain English for a teacher, written it out as a logic model, they would say, oh, that's crap. You can't sort students that way. But it was happening, and the wizards was spinning dials behind the scenes, and we just accepted it because in many cases academics don't understand it. So that's why, even though I sometimes get negative reactions from people that I would call peers and friends around my interest in learning analytics, the reality is that it's a space that's making a bigger impact on the long-term trajectory of education than almost any other phenomenon I'm aware of, and that's why we have to get into the conversation.
Thank you.
That's a fantastic discussion. And George, I love the way you ended that. There's a really strong call here for this to be the central issue of education technology. Don't let me talk about this. Kisa Johnson, I believe, has a hand up. Kisa, are you ready?
Hey everybody, how you guys doing? Susan, thanks so much talking about ethics, because when I was in a working group and we were talking about like, what do you guys think about analytics? And to me, I had to speak very strongly about my position. I'm a learning designer. I work for MSU. I just so happens to work at MSU, and when we're talking about analytics, me coming from where I come from as a designer, which I'm very empathetic, and I look at other people's situations over myself when I'm designing systems, I was thinking about like the bias in what you were talking about with these algorithms, and you had to just share that example about how they were trying to gatekeep African Americans, because I'm African American myself, and I always have to look at that in the peripheral when they're talking about using these analytics in a certain way. And I'm like, well, who's making these decisions? Where is, when we have these gatekeepers, how are their biases being challenged when they're sitting here looking at these designs and coming up with these systematic systems? And I'm like, to me, the whole part about designing anything is, being empathetic when you're about all these people that you're putting in these learning systems. And I don't see that. I don't feel that. Although that's what I exude, and that's at the forefront of my design when it comes to my principles when I'm working. And I wanted to hear a little bit about, because I hear the empathy in your voice, George, and maybe because you've been around a lot longer, you've been working with different systems, but I wanted to really hear from your point when it comes to challenging bias and, within design and being empathetic. I wanted to hear your point of view and standpoint on that.
Well, it's a really good question, and obviously a very complex one. I think the idea of bias is evident in everything that we do. So bias isn't something that's just there when we're involved in sort of technological activity. I think one of the things that's interesting technologically is it can make bias explicit. So let's say back to the example that I mentioned earlier about, let's say, an algorithm, predictive models that targets African Americans as higher predictions of criminal behavior. Well, all that does in many cases has made existing biases that people have held evident in the algorithms. Like algorithms, at least now, don't write themselves. They may well in the future, but for now, they're not writing themselves. And so that means that the bias in an algorithm is the bias of the writer, or in some cases, just the lack of experience. So I would say almost in Plato's, of a society should be run by philosophers, I would say algorithms should be designed by philosophers, but they're not. Algorithms are being designed, and this is not an ageism thing, but they're quite often being designed by young individuals who have strong data and technical skills, and there are certain profiles of individuals that enter those fields. We saw that with the development of early MOOCs out of Stanford. They were basically an instantiation of a computer science framework of the world. And so that's how it was brought out, and that's how MOOCs were developed. Algorithms are being developed the same way, but we know the bias is there. I just want the bias to be explicit. We can never be bias-free. It's impossible to be bias-free, but we can eliminate bias that violates our social fabric. So we can eliminate bias that might target race, or that might target someone from a poverty background, rather than, and that as a way of sorting them. Like I would think sorting someone who comes from a low poverty area should be one of making sure that they have adequate resources available. Not like we've heard with some school systems where they find certain zip codes that have high failure rates, they just stop marketing to those zip codes and trying to draw students from those zip codes. So making those kinds of existing mindsets clearly available goes a long way. But, and this is a bit of a cop-out on my end, this isn't going to be a conversation that we're going to solve quickly. Like everything that relates to algorithms and algorithmic sorting, it has to be worked through philosophically, it has to be worked through psychologically, socially, it has to be worked through politically, it has to be worked through in the legal system. Like we're on a 20-year cycle of trying to understand that an algorithm today is the new rule of law that we developed 200 plus years to create. And so now algorithms are going to do some of this work for us, and we can't expect that it's going to be a one conversation. It has to infiltrate every aspect of business and schools and government and so on. And that's why it's a seemingly intractable problem, but it's one that we have to be a part of, because the future is being written by individuals who have a narrow perspective of what knowledge and what equity is.
Thank you, George. I really appreciate that. That share.
I second Kisa's thanks. And I also think, Kisa, thank you for bringing that up. The empathy argument is a terrific one. Unfortunately, we're out of time, friends. Our hour is up. And George, you no doubt have a plane that's going to catch you.
Well, thanks, Brian, for the opportunity. And I really do apologize. I had thought my connection would hold out better, and it's a bit of an embarrassment on my end, and it did added stress to yours. So I apologize for that. But thanks for those of you that stayed and asked questions and engaged. And Brian, it's great work as always that you're doing.
Well, I really appreciate it, and I sympathize, and I admire your manful willingness to keep going. Thank you, George. Shindig folks, we need to bring up the slides and show what's coming up next. And let me just say, we still don't have bandwidth across the world the way it should be. And I really appreciate George's willingness to engage. And for everyone who's been in this call, in this forum today, I really appreciate your steadfastness and ability to be patient. Now, next week, next Thursday, June 2nd, we have a new guest. We have Robbie Melton, and you guys are in for a real treat. Robbie is the Associate Vice Chancellor of Mobilizing Emerging Technology for the Tennessee Board of Regents. We're going to be talking about the Internet of Things. Robbie has a ton of ideas, arguments, and examples to show us. So please, you'll see there two links. One is to her project page. You can find out more about her. And then below that is a YouTube interview where you can see her discussing the Internet of Things for education. We hope to see you then. In the meantime, we have a couple more recordings and notes from previous forum sessions coming up on my blog and on YouTube, so you can catch up with ones you have missed. And also, hopefully very soon, I'll be sending everyone who is registered for a forum event, I'll be sending you a poll to ask for your ideas about the Future Trends Forum going forward. In the meantime, I'll be here for about 10 more minutes, so stick around if you want to chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Future Trends Forum.